Welcome to the Intelligent Teams podcast, where we interview leading thinkers from business and the sciences of mind to find new ways to help your teams and organizations thrive. I'm your host, Daniel Sasser. This week's guest on Intelligent Teams is Systems Family Constellations Facilitator and Coach Zita Tulyahikayo. I shared the story of how Zita and I met in the episode, and it was a brilliant conversation. Zita shares so much wisdom from the world of systems, family constellations, and she'll explain what that is. And I'm really excited to share it with my audience here. This episode is also really different from some of the ones I've done in the past. It goes a lot more into my own and Zita's backgrounds. It touches on areas of history as well that I'm not so familiar with. And not especially comfortable with, but it was such a cool conversation that I wanted to still have it on the podcast. So this episode veers into some themes. We talk about slavery, we talk about Jewish history, areas in which may not be everyone's interest and also may spark different questions for you. So I hope you take this episode in the spirit it's intended of being a really cool conversation with someone who I really wanted to bring to my audience. So with that in mind, I'm happy to welcome Zita Tulyahikayo to the podcast. Welcome, Zita, to Intelligent Teams.
Thank you, Daniel. It's lovely to be here.
I want to jump in with what is a system, family, constellation, facilitator, and coach. But I think before then, because for me it's like so salient in how we know each other, I want to share with the listeners how we met a couple of weeks ago and a bit of the conversation we had there, because I found that like we had a conversation and I was like, I want to talk more to this person.
That was a very systemic moment.
It was a systemic moment, and you can explain to me why or what that means.
You tell the story first, because I like hearing it.
Yeah. So Zita and I were both in the sauna in our local Northwest London gym, and I asked Zita how her session was. I think I'm going to address this to the audience rather than address it to you, because that feels weird, but we'll change register as appropriate. I asked Zita how her workout was, and she said, I should have been able to do more. And I was like, well, we could always do more. And I can't remember the exact phrasing that you used, but you said something like, well, because of my ethnic makeup or because of my racial background, I should have been able to do more. And I was like, go on. And you said, well, I've been trying to work out in a way that's aligned with my ancestors, and my forebears lived in the mountains and would have carried stuff up. So I'm doing a lot of treadmill and carrying things uphill. And I said, okay, that's interesting. And then you mentioned, maybe you can pick up the story from here, because it feels weird to be putting the words in your mouth. And you mentioned about working with ancestral trauma and ancestral healing. So yeah, could we reprise that bit of the conversation? We can pick up. Imagine you're in a sauna in Northwest London, dear audience.
Okay, yeah. Well, what I loved was you brought this word. There was a word you had for what I was doing, which was called rucking. I was like, oh, that sounds kind of good. So I was carrying a 5 kilogram pack because I am from this part of me is from the southwest of Uganda, which is very mountainous, and we're the guardians of the mountain gorillas. And when I go there, I am just in awe of these women and tiny children who go all the way up to the top of the mountain and start, working the land, carrying enormous weights on their back, and they do it with such ease. And I'm just like, it's incredible. It's in me, so let me start doing it. And it's been actually really good, because it really focuses the mind on the intention of where one is going, which is up a hill. And the hill doesn't have to be part of the obstacle. It can be actually part of the process and finding enjoyment of going up that hill. And similarly, healing transgenerational trauma, which is trauma inherited or is passed down from one generation to the next. Often people recoil and think, oh, that's awful and how difficult it must be. But the challenge is taking you to the prize at the top, which is the fullness of what we've inherited, which is all the strengths, because we're here, right? I'm here to talk about it. I'm capable and I'm able. So rather than, it's not just about focusing on what we inherit that was difficult or that we didn't like or didn't approve of or didn't agree with our parents. It's about saying, but on the other side, if I turn the coin over, there is this gem, there's this juice that I can draw on from my ancestors and use in my own way in the life that I'm living today. So I
Yeah, and I
think
thought
it's,
that was really beautiful because I'm part of the Jewish community. I have a Jewish background. That's big part of my identity, and a lot of it is trauma. It's the Holocaust. It's the persecutions. It's the Spanish Inquisition. It's like we fixate a lot about that, rightly or wrongly or whatever. But it's a big part of the inheritance of what it means to be Jewish. Is like what it means to have been persecuted as a Jew over time. And that
yeah.
idea of transgenerational trauma weighs very heavily. And I loved what you described as it being a kind of transgenerational healing, is to look at the gifts that you got from your ancestry and from that same background, and maybe from those same events or even those same persecutions or those same instances that now lead you to be able to live a full life now. And that's a really whole perspective.
Yeah. And actually, that was the very reason why the work was developed in Germany after the war was there was obviously a very strong need to support the descendants and the survivors and their descendants, because this trauma is, as we now know, is still rippling through the system in a multitude of ways. But what I also realized, because being on the other half, I'm Barbadian, and there's been, in recent times, a lot of stories about Black people and how difficult Black people it is to be Black people, and that inspired me actually to look, because we are Caribbean, but we're Creole, so we're a mixture of things. And I was kind of surprised to discover that um, through doing the work and training in it, that the Holocaust trauma was in my system or was landing. I was like, how's that even possible? And so when you start to dive into the family secrets, which is what I did, I found out that my grandfather was Jewish. And this discovery collided at the same time as George Floyd's death. And my grandfather was killed by the police in Barbados for being Jewish. And then I had to find out, why were there Jews there anyway? I mean, come on. And then a whole door opened, and I was like, oh my goodness. First of all, half the things that I thought were Barbadian was actually Italian Jewish culture. And even our food, our national dish that we all eat on Friday night, was an Italian Jewish dish that had traveled to the Caribbean from Pitigliano in 16 something or other. And all the stories that I had read about how slavery had started and arrived in Barbados and so on and so forth was all a whole heap of nonsense, to be short. And I was fortunate to discover that Jews keep very, very good records of their history, understandably so. And then that opened more doors, and I discovered that the oldest synagogue in the West was in Barbados. And then, in the time that I was doing this journey and rediscovering and scraping through the layers of history, Barbados and its government were actually doing more excavation to find more of the presence of Jews who'd really informed and created the bedrock of the island. Even the name of the island is a Portuguese word for island of bearded men.
Hmm.
So that was the realization and the understanding of the depth of the connection of the work. And then once I'd learned the foundation, it just opened up a whole new way of looking at the world we occupy now and our history, and how family systems bring a more useful information about the history of trauma than what we're given in history books, which is obviously distorted by the person's perspective, because it's not balanced, it's not full, and has bias obviously in built into it, and all sorts of other things that aren't helpful if you are from the Caribbean. And also actually if you're from East Africa. So yeah, that was a long a long road, but it was the beginning of a really beautiful road.
Yeah. It's because my and we'll get into the sort of the nuts and bolts of the systemic constellation stuff, but I want to just like hang out on this topic for a little longer, just because it's of
Yeah.
such personal concern and interest. Is like my understanding of the history of it, and like correct me if I'm wrong, is that like a lot of the reason why Jews were in Barbados around that time was either as like plantation owners or bringing slaves over. So maybe that's like an incorrect assumption and they were there for other reasons. But there is like this weird and uncomfortable and I don't know, contradictory like history of specifically Jewish roles in the slave trade, let's say, which may like not have been unique. It made historical a certain kind of historical fittedness at the time. But I imagine having both those ancestries or both those histories contained in your system is an area for exploration. I'm not even sure if that's the right question, but that's what comes up
Yeah,
for me
yeah,
hearing
yeah.
that
No, and
story.
it's a really beautiful question because it is totally missing from history. And you brought up and highlighted, the significant traumas that the Jewish community is focused on. Well, the Spanish Inquisition was also the persecution and the exile of Jews out of Portugal and Spain. And many of them were sent out. They were first forced to convert, so they were called New Christians or Conversos or Moranos. And they were forced by the Catholic Church to go out and prove their loyalty to Catholicism by converting others. So a lot of it had actually originally started spreading out towards India, and Goa was a significant colony in the 1500s of forcing conversion. So you go to Goa and you find that there are these names, and at first you just think, oh, they've got Portuguese name because the Portuguese are here, and it's like the Portuguese are here and the Portuguese are here, but who are these Portuguese? When you ask the question, something different starts to emerge, and it's like, well, they're Jewish Portuguese names. My my husband did a case with a Jewish community a few years ago, and they went up there, and he's like, they really like me. And I said, did you ask them why? And he said, well, yeah, I told them my full name, and they were like, oh, it is the most high holy of Jewish names. And he was like, yeah, but I'm from Goa. And so in the forcing of the conversions, the Goans had to take the name of the person who had converted them. And that's the name that my passed down many generations that my husband has. But similarly, the Brazil had opened up first. There was obviously a direct connection between Portugal and Brazil, and it was on the way back from Brazil, heading back towards Europe, that they accidentally bumped into Barbados, but this time from the Caribbean side, because Christopher Columbus had swept past on the Atlantic side, and the Atlantic side of Barbados, no one wants to enter from that side. So there they found the safe place. They sent word back, and people started to come. And part of their coming and going, which was also including Brazil, was taking human cargo and bringing back the riches and the resources from South America. And so, in the balance of telling, rather than just looking at people as being evil or bad or perpetrators or colonizers, systemic invites us to ask, but why? Because people don't just wake up and think, oh, how can I mess up the world? There is a reason, and usually it is because something terrible is happening. Because in those days, to go all that way in those kinds of boats, of course, they were great, but something terrible must have been happening. And that was how I got to the track back of the connection of the slave trade and who was playing what parts in it. Because the English people certainly weren't leaving their country paths to come down to the Caribbean and get hot and sweaty and deal with mosquitoes. So it had to be, well, the people who were on the lower rung of society in Europe, and that was the Jews. And then what I next discovered was some other book I came across by chance, was that there was this connection with the slave traders, and the forefront running the slave trade out of West Africa were African women. And because they had close contact, this community, they formed families. And if you go to Seville, the archives of all of the transactions are there in the records. So there is no real story that is true that says, I don't know where I'm from. You can go to the archives and you can find the transactions, and you can more or less find how your family ended up in which island and why they were taken there. Barbados became a turning point. But there were marriages between these women and the Jewish men. And there are records of those as well. And those are rather beautiful. So the people of Lagos or Lagos and that coast, it's referred to as coastal coloured skin because of the fusing of the Jews and Africans over this extended period of time for trade, for survival, and for, well, have a good time, because the women made a lot of money.
And none of this is to sort of denigrate or to downplay like the suffering that was caused as a result of that system, right? But it is also saying what there's a kind of erasure of the agency of those African women who were running their element of the slave trade to be like,
Yeah.
this was an argument you made in a Substack post recently, which I enjoyed, which was that in lots of ways, like African leaders directing, running, profiting from, involved in the slave trade. What this is it's a historical element, and you could see one could choose to see the slave trade as, and this is not normally the topic of intelligent teams. Normally we talk about teams and cognitive
But
science,
this
but
is
this is
about peace.
it's a different kind of team, yeah.
Yeah.
But the point you made was that you could see it as a colonizing of America by the Africans.
Yeah. Well, you see, the I got into a fight with a DNA company a few years ago. I was furious with them because I was like, "Oh, you're just using my name to say the DNA of where I'm from." And then I was telling my dad about it, with all my outrage, and he said, "Ah, yes. Now there's a part of our history that I didn't tell you." And I was like, "What?" He said, well, for many years we sold slaves. We had so many, and I do believe some of them ended up in the Caribbean where your mother is from. And I was like, oh, well, oh, okay. And the thing I find interesting about my dad, and this is also which is part of the balancing effect, is he sort of made this nodding thing. I think we're ashamed of that, or at least we're supposed to be. But it really puts it in perspective for me that depending on the angle and the perspective that you look at a story, multiple things are true. And we're almost compelled to say that slavery was terrible and awful. But we never actually look at how many people survived. I'm here as a result of it. Tons of people in England are. Barbados's GDP excelling, flourishing, and it's not producing sugar anymore, but it is still busting out an income that is exceeds its size and the number of people who are on it. And yes, people do suffer and struggle, but also one can say what's happening in the Congo now, for example, sustainability, is worse and the same as what happened 250 years ago. And just like then, no one is batting an eyelid about little kids going down mines so that we can have our phones and our electric cars and our net zero. So in that frame, it allowed me to understand how normal slavery is and always has been for humanity. And we, I think, as humans, have the capacity to mourn certain types of loss and not others. And that's, I think, more telling about us than it is about that humans have been trading human labor, which is the most valuable resource on earth, since the beginning of time.
And in a way, starting with, it feels like a very uncomfortable topic for me. Maybe I'll just name that because it's
Yeah.
like, I don't know, white or white appearing man going into thorny topic, of which like I'm not at all like equipped to like have the historical argument, and it's a very sensitive issue, for like, understandably, obviously, just as if we again we have covered the Holocaust, we have covered yeah, the most sensitive and events that cause the most suffering or so much suffering, as well as creating all of the flip side like joy and healing from that. And in a way, like that's a it's a good starting point for like where does these things are so sensitive and so maybe difficult to talk about, and so well, you can't talk about that because you're not Jewish, and I can't talk about that because I'm not black, and that's not where my ancestors, whatever. That's maybe a great starting point for like where does this systemic approach come in, and with these really difficult topics,
Yeah,
what does
well,
it
I think
offer?
and thank you for sharing that. And I do understand, or I'm learning to understand that it's different for people because I've gone through this whole process from being, a rabid activist who's like anti-racism and slavery to doing my own personal healing work and my family work and my community work and my wider field of work of the healing, the trauma of belonging to both slave sellers, slave traffickers, and slaves. And that is not a perspective I ever thought I would be able to hold respectfully and dignify all the parties concerned. But that is a result of systemic healing. And I'm talking about systemic family constellations healing. It has a particular approach that brings a fullness of understanding of what it is to be human. I'm not surprised that you, as a Jewish male, would find it difficult to talk about because the history of what your people have gone through means that you measure very high on humanitarianism and empathy for suffering, more so than other groups, because for them it's different. I've often found, for example, as a Black person, it can be people who, oh, there's someone who's suffering. So if I focus on their suffering, I don't have to look at my own suffering, which is, the Cartman drama triangle, which is also happens not just in families, but in wider systems. So systemic constellations, which was, born out of a number of different healing modalities: psychoanalysis, Jungian and Freudian psychotherapy, transactional analysis, family therapy, and Milton Erickson, just to name but a few, has a spiritual aspect because it invites us to look at the humanity of humans and how we are, and our loyalties and our conscience and our desire for revenge and the fullness of what it is to be humans, rather than looking at us one-dimensional beings that can only see black and white and can only live in a binary world. So and that really appealed to me, as someone, particularly as an African, because that is really pretty much the essence or the distillation of what African culture is or was about before colonization happened. And Bert had spent time with the Zulus, who are part of a migration further down from East Africans, who had this understanding of what supports tribes or clans to go on. And when he brought that back and fused that with all the other teachings, he created this really useful and phenomenal work. But it's not for everybody, because it invites us to really agree to all the other people on the planet as they are. And that's not necessarily easy for people to do, or the price of it is too much. who are we without our wars in our heads? So that's the work I trained in and why I loved it. And then, doing that with couples who are mini organizations because they bring two cults together and, you have children. It's not dissimilar in its effect. And working with organizations who either have been involved in collective trauma because of the history from which they started. It was exploitative or extractive. And I work with not-for-profit organizations as well.
So we've delineated some of the edges of what systemic work might be, but if we were going to start from the beginning and say, right, you've never had any, as someone who's never done any therapy or experienced any kind of systemic work, what's this got to do with constellations? What does this work look like? Like, how would you introduce it to a complete blank slate person?
But that's the $4 million question. Because, oh goodness. Okay. So constellations, that word I would say, okay, let's go a little bit poetic storytelling style. If you imagine that in the sky there's a constellations of stars, and your family is like a constellation of stars. If you were to take one of the stars out of the constellation of stars would start to collapse in and put its weight on what it experiences or understands as the strongest star that can take the weight or hold the burden of the excluded star or the missing part. And that happens in families. There will be an exclusion, someone is missing, something hasn't happened, or that should have happened, or might have happened, or any of those kinds of things. And in America, they call it the black sheep of the family. The one who carries the family trauma is the one who goes to therapy and says, "Oh my goodness." And they will usually be the one, typically, they're the one who comes to a constellation, systemic constellations workshop. And we look at constellations as creating three-dimensional living maps of the individual's family system. Having interviewed them, we filter that through the framework of understanding what we call other orders of love. We'll revert back to that later. And we set up this, invite them to set up an image of the system as they see it in their heart by inviting different people to represent their family members. And then we wait and we see what happens. And then the facilitator, my role is to facilitate the movements that open up the flow of love that brings the constellation back into a healthy alignment, or alignment that has enough strength that the members can flourish and thrive. And that strength is drawn typically from acknowledging a truth at the center of the trauma, because the trauma or the problem also is the solution.
So practically speaking, it means, and that was a very that was a very beautiful and also practical explanation, and you sort of blended it together. That probably wasn't your first time explaining this thing. So practically speaking, it would be I go to a workshop with a bunch of strangers or with people that I already know.
It will be with strangers. It's usually only one family member who comes. Sometimes people bring a friend for support, and then they don't do the work, and the friend does. The people will be like, "Ooh." So yes, I will generally post an event on Eventbrite, and it's open to members of the public to sign up, pay their fee, and at the appointed time they arrive. And part of the beautiful thing about systemic work, because we're also working with what we call the knowing field, is that, okay, let me rewind a little bit. When we are born, our parents keep us alive, even though we don't know how to say in words what we need from them. So they learn to discern our cry or something in the atmosphere that says, "Oh, little Johnny needs more feeding or nappy changed," or "Oh, he's got wind," or so on and so forth, all without language. And that's empathy. So we all have this empathy, which is kind of actually our strongest muscle, and it decreases a little bit once we have language. When it comes to healing trauma that's embodied and has been passed in these unspoken parts of the family system, we're working in a similar way by seeing how people move and stand and talk about what they're feeling in the constellation to surface this information that's lost in the system or has been forgotten or ignored with all the talk. It's the felt sense that translates into a language that facilitators are trained to understand or extract more information until it starts to create a movement. And that movement will be what we call a healing movement. So they then have the capacity to turn or move towards a family member through who they've been turned away from, or so on and so forth. So it's empathy which brings people to come to the workshop in the first place. And then there's a field of empathy that means that all the people who come on that particular day are already in empathy with each other because they've got a similar kind of trauma as you. And that means that maybe I'll do 5 or 6 pieces of work, constellations, but the representatives will also receive the benefit if they are chosen to be in your constellation, because they will have some commonality to that experience of that family member of yours that they're representing.
So you end up with a scenario where I might be in the middle of the workshop if I'm the one undergoing or participating in the constellation, and I've got a bunch of the people who have shared empathy with me but who are essentially strangers representing different members of my family system, my system. I talk to, and that's facilitated that I would talk to them, or we'd talk about the trauma, or we'd talk about the issue, and they would be able to pick up on some important element of it just by the way that it's set up and by connection to their own experience. Is that right?
Yeah, so I will do an interview with you as the issue holder, and I'm looking for who or what is missing in the story. Because we all tell stories and we repeat them over and over again, but there will be something or some piece of information that's missing. Once I discern a sense of that, I have a sense of what orders of the flow of love that supports family systems or human systems has been interrupted. When I invite you as the issue holder to set up the constellation, you're scanning around this room and you're choosing someone, I'll say, to represent your mother and to represent your father. And going back to these little micro messages that are in the subtle movements people make, you will choose someone who's running patterns that are similar to your parents, because you're not interviewing them. You're just looking at them and going by a feeling of, oh yeah, you'll do to represent my dad. And when we come into that circle, we call it a field of knowledge. The information from the interview has informed the field of knowledge, which is the empathic aspect. So when that person who you picked to represent your dad stands in the field where you position them, they will start to have the thoughts and feelings of your father. And I will ask them, what are the thoughts and feelings that you're having? And they don't know whether your father goes to football on a Saturday or not, but they will know or have a sense of how your father feels. And they'll tell me. And then your mother will have, the person representing your mother will go, but, and she will be in empathy with your mother. And we start this dialogue in the field of empathy and unspoken stories, which have actually the most power. I think the simplest and best way I can describe it is, many of us know the experience of going to a party, opening the door and going, oh, wow, I love the vibe here. No one's spoken, but you just feel like, oh, I'm going to keep going in, right? Or maybe after a while, it's like, oh, something shifted, it's time to leave. That's our empathy, and that's what we're working with. It's nothing more magical really than that, but that is in itself pretty magical.
Yeah, I participated in a constellation once as part of a systemic coaching agile training course thing, and it was quite amazing how it, as a newcomer, it sounds like to something that's impossible. Like, well, how I'm not your father, I'm not your mother. How can I represent them in a way that really means something? But the way that it's set up and the energy, I can't think of a better word. The energies that you can pick up on can or are able to have these important to provide insight to the person in the middle, and then yeah, also to the people who are playing these roles. They're like, oh yeah, that's that feeling that I have representing someone else's family member also represents me in some way or represents an issue that I'm holding.
Yeah, yeah. And so in the position of repping, you also receive the healing that's for the person you're repping because it's yours as well in some way. I mean, uh, you know, collective trauma has an effect. The effect that it has on the family manifests in certain things that humans will do in order to protect the ultimate need to survive. And it may be withholding oneself or bringing too much of oneself or addiction or so the the events that create the patterns don't have to be exactly the same for them to manifest in a similar way that each can understand, which is also why it's generational. You know, people born in the 70s have a completely different experience of life compared to people born, you know, in the 90s or even now. You know, we give the boomers a pretty hard time, but when you think about what they represent and what they survived, of course they would be a little bit selfish or whatever label it is we apply to them. You know, they made it through the war. Their parents, their mothers were pregnant at the time when the whole world was at war. You know, and different things have their effect.
Yeah, it's there may be like another boomer generation of the COVID era, the ones who came after that. And,
Yeah,
um,
yeah. And you know, even the stories are still kind of in countries. So last year I went to I went to a couple of places because I was sort of trying to drop into the field actually of the trauma of Europe because it tends to be focused on Germany, but if you go to Romania and you're like, whoa, wait a second. Oh, oh my, oh my. And that's when it really lands. The Nazis didn't do it on their own. They had help, a lot of help. And then to Prague, I think I found that the hardest. When I was in Romania, it was just after October the 7th, so the security was on maximum. And it felt very poignant that the Jewish quarter there didn't exist. We'd gone on a little map and it's like, oh, what do you mean it's gone? And there was something very potent and symbolic in that. And then when we got to the synagogue, which is generally open, the security, no way, not even a look in, don't even put your toe across this line. And I was like, but I'm friendly. Um, but then there's also another layer, which is the palace. I don't know if you've been to, but that anyway, it's otherworldly in Romania. There's almost like a void in the atmosphere. But Prague was that was like a soccer punch to the stomach. It really stopped me in my tracks because it's one thing kind of it's sometimes working removed from the stories, and then you feel inspired to actually go to the places and the stories that people have told you, because it's not my business to go into their house and sit down with dinner and go, how was it for you? But I do find I'm interested in going to the places, and that is really quite profound.
What was it about Prague that sucker punched you as opposed to
Because
what
going
that
into
wasn't?
the old synagogue, there's a building just to the side, and all the names are written on the wall, and there's thousands of them, and they're written in tiny print. So that in itself is overwhelming. But then, ironically, or not, systemically, names of people that I know and have met in my travels working in fashion in New York and LA, who I was just like, oh hey, you realize, oh, they're the ones whose family survived. And I'm friends with them, but I'm not really taking in now until I see it written on the wall that their families were here. And I've just taken their existence for granted.
It's an I so I none of my family directly like were involved in as far as I know. There's no survivors in my lineage. So we all left before that. So it's an interesting. I've always had an interest. What I think is quite an interesting perspective on like the Holocaust and the European Jewish suffering there, because it's very much in my context and it's grown up in it and it's imbibed, even if it wasn't actually my family. And if I went to my great grandparents were from Latvia, and I went there a few years ago to Liepāja,
Yeah.
and yeah, my family had been from Dvinsk called Daugavpils, which is sort of down the road. It's not a big place, and I'd learnt about. I maybe had a similar experience. I'd learnt about the Holocaust growing up. I'd seen it. I'd been to Auschwitz. I'd been to all these places. I'd like. It was very much part of like knowledge and awareness and memorialization and fear of it recurring, and very high sensitivity to ways in which it might be about to happen and all these different things. And I went on holiday to Liepāja, and it's a place that before the war had, I think, not a big Jewish community. I think it's about 1,500 Jews, and then after the war there were seven, and all the rest were like carted off to forests or to concentration camps. And I had a similar experience of like the real visceral, like of my own loss, right? Of these are people who were, if not direct cousins, cousins of cousins of cousins,
Mm.
and that sort of, it really sort of, yeah, that's sort of what came up. Hearing you describing going to Prague there. And even if like I'm thinking of my poor listeners who hear enough of my Jewish anxieties, but thinking about, we all carry our versions of these, our traumas, our shames, our difficult stories that we, whether we know it or not, form who we think we are in the world, and also like who we are. And it's a podcast that's about work and organizations, but I think it's worth spending a lot of time here because like I don't stop being that person when I show up at work with those
Exactly.
same histories and those same traumas and those
Exactly.
same
All of this is
realities.
going into every organization that there is, whether it is the NHS, whether it is our government, whether it's non-profit, whether it is the telephone company, whether it's the postal company, whether it's the brand new sexy startup. And the challenges that are in organizations are the challenges of the people who make up the organization. An organization is just a macrocosm of a family, and it will have similar issues. If a CEO leaves or is fired and it's in kind of a little bit, the next one who comes in and takes his place will still struggle. And people go, oh, why? Oh, he's not very popular. But there are many, it's like, if you had a family and it's got a dad and there's a divorce and the dad leaves and a stepdad comes in, that stepdad is not going to have it easy if the other one left on unpleasant terms. So Yeah, we forget that. I remember I'm from the generation where it's like, when we were being prepared to go out from university and go to work. And remember, you leave all of your personal stuff at the door. Well, that is absolutely bonkers. It's impossible. We can't, we don't, and we won't. If we left all of our personal stuff at the door, then why bother even employing us? Because nothing would come through the door. So, but we take all of ourselves through that door in how we relate to each other and in the power dynamics and so on and so forth, whether it's the known parts of ourselves or the unknown parts of ourselves of missing or lost ancestors that we don't know or didn't know. And
And
that's
it's
pretty amazing, fascinating, intriguing, and still relatively untouched or untapped.
yeah. And my sense of it from my short career and the places that I've worked, which tend to be like tech companies or companies in techie departments that are like nice and human centered and care about this stuff and want you to bring your whole self to work and all this stuff. I'm very poorly equipped to actually deal with that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so they bring your whole self to work, but like the bits that we want, the creativity and the passion and the whatever, but like
Yeah,
ide-
yeah,
ideally not the anxiety and the stress and the like and the fear of unleashing your anger on like the whole, those bits you can leave in your therapist's office, and that's probably right because there's a degree at which I don't know, you can, if we all spent all our time thinking at work about all the ways in which who am I and how do I fit into this, well, we wouldn't get anything done.
yeah.
um, but there's a there's a balance to be had there, and yeah, I don't know how to do it well. So I'm interested in, maybe that's could turn into a question, which is how does systemic constellations work fit into that, or fit into an organization where people do know each other and it's not strangers meeting through Eventbrite.
So in in organizations, typically how I will do it is I will work with teams. So I'll work with senior, middle, and then the ones who are forgotten, but all of the staff who are actually really holding up, admin, all of those wonderful people who are doing the really essential work of keeping the organization going. So working with those three groups. And what I've learned to do is keep them in peer groups so that they are free to bring what is essential to be brought. And then they take that back into the system and it trickles through the system so that what should and typically does eventually happen is they start to make the adjustment without knowing what the other has done, but by doing, rather than doing full constellations, what I do are mini constellations, so that you're giving the team the tools to tap into the field of wisdom that is in their organization and sense it for themselves. And because even in organizations, same with family, a lot of blaming takes place. And whilst we're finger pointing, we're not actually taking or paying attention to what's our role in this, what's our part in this. So that will be generally how I do it. I'm more commonly called in to oversee a transition of leadership because that has a profound effect, like the step parent coming in. So I'll work with the team and the outgoing chief, and then I'll work with the team and the incoming chief. And as we're constellating the outgoing chief, we're starting the process of bringing in a representative for the incoming chief so that the system can adjust on the emotional, psychological, and felt senses to a outsider and tune them to have that shift in loyalty. because that's often what interrupts the process of a new chief coming out and an old one leaving who's much loved, is the shift in loyalty, and that can be disruptive to the whole system if that's not supported or facilitated well. So that's the bits that I like doing.
So with the group that don't know each other, everyone represents someone. If I'm the issue holder, I think you called it. If I'm the issue holder, other people in the constellation represent the other people in my
Yeah.
system. When you're working with the team, everyone just represents themselves. As in,
It depends what piece we're doing, but there's what's called a blind constellation, where I know what the others are repping, but I don't tell them, so they can't bring their stories to it. And actually, I really like blind constellations because they're really mind-blowing because there is no story. You just get this very clean representation, and they're often more accurate than when people know or think they know who they're representing. So there's only certain organizations I'll do that with, though. There has to be a high level of openness to working that way, which means they're usually predominantly female organizations, or there is an openness to alternative approaches.
well, I published something last week in defense of woo. And so maybe that's along the same sort of lines. So, how would a blind constellation work?
It's all the same. The only difference is I choose the reps and I just rest my hands and I hold in my head who they're going to represent. So that the organization, the team don't know who's what repping what, but we've just set up and then I'll actually leave it more fluid and let the reps move how they want to move and bring the information that they want to bring.
So, how is there still an issue holder who's sort of sitting at the middle of it, or
But
is it
they are
different?
the issue holder and they are the field.
So everyone, um, so you've got a group of six people. Everyone's representing someone else in that system, but they don't know, and you've like
Yeah, but
you've
they
passed
would
on.
that would have been after we've done a lot of forming, norming, and there is high trust, and then we surface the things that no one wants to say out loud. But now with that field of trust, we can surface it, and then we might do a what do you call it? A hidden vote for which is the issue that it's going to most benefit the whole team and the organization. So that will be the issue we constellate, and then I'll choose representatives for the part.
So there's not one issue holder there. It's the team's issue, and
Yeah,
everyone's the issue holder.
yeah, yeah, because it's an organization.
So as a participant in a blind constellation, I am trying to move towards where I energetically feel myself moving, even though I don't know which role I'm playing, and only you do, and somehow, and that still leads to it working. That is kind of mind blowing. I think I'd have to see that to fully understand the dynamics of it. But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I mean, in public workshops, I'll often use it as well if it's a quite controversial issue. The person will speak about the issue, but I won't tell um, the issue holders what they're representing. Because one, we've got a lot of new people who have discovered Constellations work from watching Goop or Netflix, and they're coming thinking it's something different to what it is. And two, humans hold a lot of stories. And three, the age range is broader. So it leaves more space for a lot of that noise to just be out of it. And sometimes I will just tell the issue holder who is what, so that they are in alignment and can see this person who might have said that. So there are different ways in which you can work with it to get what I would call the cleanest representation, where someone can't say, oh, well, they knew this and blah, 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 blah. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Are there any? How do you do the forming, storming, norming work to prepare a team to be able to
With the
do
team? Oh,
constellation?
yeah.
Yeah.
So there's creating the container and creating a sense of safety. So through checking in, bringing one's name, what's brought one's here, and then creating the rules of the tribe. Those are really important. I have like 2 or 3 rules, and then I invite them to bring the rules that they think will support them or what they need. So we're surfacing as much as possible, and then and I've actually done this with groups you'd never think would be open to a guided meditation, which then strengthens the group, and then a little bit of humor of our fragility. By then, you're usually pretty much, you can feel that the room is ready to work. Um, and that's if we've got one day. But if you've got 2 or 3 days, then you've got a little bit more time to process with little exercises. Like there's one where you kind of have a line and people can see physically how it is when someone is who they've known for 20 years because they've sat at the same desk finds out something about their co-worker. Oh, I didn't know that you, all of that stuff builds trust. But people are actually a lot more trusting than we think, because most of that work is done in either signing up or hiring me or whatever it is to have that workshop and then show up. They're already saying, I'm whatever it is we're going through is so awful. I'm desperate. I'll do anything. And I'm trusting that you are the one who will help me because I've tried everything else.
Mm. Would you work with a group who are resistant to the idea of some coach coming in and doing some activity that, or does it
Yeah,
depend?
actually, I did recently work with a group who have experienced, it's a community and they've experienced an awful lot of trauma and they don't really have trust for anything or anyone. And even the first meeting I had with them, they were sort of like they'd agreed to kind of let their guard down and let one of their members who suggested I meet them to come in. And it so I did 2 pre-sessions with them of 3 hours. And it wasn't until we'd done a full day of work of looking at their issue in multitude of different ways. And I brought in professional reps. At the very, very end of that, one of them said something very beautiful but very honest. Was there were so many times I've just wanted to walk out and go, "Now, man, what's she talking about?" And I'm so glad I stayed. And that for me was I think really important because it's a community that's quite close to my heart and means a lot to me. Um, but I understand the degree of mistrust of everyone and anyone that they have right now. So to kind of make that breakthrough was quite profound and important. And since then, they've started coming to the public workshops, which is quite wonderful. And it's been a long held dream, actually.
Mm.
Yeah.
Sounds like very satisfying work.
Yeah.
I want to get a bit into the just a few more nuts and bolts from how you set up a space like that, because I think for my audience, setting up psychologically safe spaces for teams to try different activities is important. You mentioned you bring a couple of rules to the team to begin with. What are your rules?
Oh, okay. Leave judgment at the door. Assume good intent. So always assume that everybody speaking from the kindest place they possibly can in that given moment. And I always forget the third one. It's gone. But those two, for sure, uh, really, really help.
Do you then, if you notice someone being like, well, hang on, like you can't say that, or
Doesn't
you point
happen.
back at them, it just doesn't.
It's never happened.
Hmm.
Um, I do quite a bit of introduction of myself, so my history, where I'm from, and I say, look, these are the things I'm loyal to secretly or overtly. So you will hear that in where I'm coming from, and this is my view, and this is the way I work. Um, so that and what we would call housekeeping. So what are the rules of your tribe? Can we wear shoes in here? So you're negotiating the terrain from both sides. You're inviting them to bring their rules on very small things. Um, I've worked with parts of the armed forces, and discipline and order in the room is really important, and I'm kind of untidy. So it was good for me to know, okay, you know what, put your pens and pencils neatly away and don't rock back and forth on your chair. Stuff like that is a way of honoring. And when people feel honored, seen, acknowledged, and valued, that's where safety comes from. So I think it's in those details of being transparent, present, and human. So I let them know I have some frailties. Like, at this age, sometimes I sweat unexpectedly. My glasses steam up, or, I also forget things that I've just said. And I hadn't explained that one time when I was working to someone, and I gave them this, what we call a sentence to say to someone else. He said, "You just told me to say that, so now it's kind of lost its power." And for me, it was like, oh, I'm sorry. You know what? My memory at this point, sometimes it just drops out and I forget what. And they're like, oh, oh, okay, thanks. That's really helpful. I'm glad you told me that. Those that truth and that honesty, I think, is what supports a container. People think you're hiding something or a part of yourself. They sniff it out, and you won't get the day or the process that you want.
And they will reflect. They will in turn hide parts of themselves that you might
Yeah,
want them to bring. Yeah.
yeah,
It's a counterintuitive way of leading, isn't it? Because you could say, well, we brought in this facilitator, and they need to like be hot shit on all their stuff and really together and all the ways that they've like got it sorted. And actually, it's the sort of opposite. It's like, well, lead with all the ways in which you haven't quite got it sorted, and you're frail and human and fallible, and you'll make mistakes like them, and then you invite them to do that, and that's where
yeah.
the good stuff is.
Well, they trust you. No one trusts someone who's perfect, because either only the dead are perfect or only the really angry. Because to be perfect and aspire for perfection, you have to be really focused on finding fault.
Can you say more about that?
Well, to know that something isn't perfect, you have to be looking for the flaws or what's wrong. And if you're more accepting and embracing of people as they are, you're not looking for perfection. The flaws are welcome, because actually also the flaws are what brings strength. I think in the diamond industry, they call them inclusions. It's the things that we should include that are part of it. That's very human. The only people that we speak truly well of, more or less, and who can't be changed or can't become imperfect, are people who've died. It's finished.
You mentioned also earlier you share your loyalties, which I thought was an interesting. Um, yeah, I was curious about that. What does that mean?
Ah, well, since we've moved into a time in human history, again, where everybody's judged by the color of their skin. I think it's helpful or important for people to know that I may look black or like a woman of color or a person of color or a colored person or whatever label it is they like to put on me. But it's very different actually to be, it's really rare to be East African and Caribbean, born in the United Kingdom at the age I am now. But in addition to that, behind my mother, my like I said, my grandfather is Jewish, and then there are Amerindians and Welsh and Ghanaians in my maternal great grandmother and great great grandmother and her husband. And then the East African is Bachiga, Maasai, and Tutsi. So when people say, "Oh, you exude too much power," I'm like, "Well, I'm from aristocrat, so maybe that's it." At least by owning it, then they can sense, "Oh, this is what I'm feeling." That sense of entitlement that people who look like you generally don't have. Well, this is where it's from. So I'm just laying out all of what might be perceived as weapons or obstructions on the here I am. This is where I come from. And if you pick up something that's unfamiliar from you, it's probably coming from one of these parts.
That's really, yeah, I find that fascinating. Like starting off with, it's not just saying like here I am and here's some stuff I might get wrong, but it's like here's what you might think of as my vulnerabilities or the things you don't like about me or the things that really grind your gears. Like here's what may annoy you about me. Here's where it comes from. Like not doing it on purpose, not apologizing necessarily. But that might be something energetically that's present here.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I
What would that
mean,
look like for me?
uh, as you said, I give quite long roundabout answers to questions. Well, I'm from storytellers, so it's not really in my wheelhouse to just say yes, no, or give a three-sentence succinct answer because there's a story. If you don't wait till the end, you wouldn't understand the whole story. But that really bothers people. And I understand why it does if they're not familiar with someone who comes from the part of the world that I do. And that's two parts because Jews and Africans like to tell stories.
Yeah. I was thinking about I have a tendency sometimes to really argue something into the ground or to like, I can't let go of a topic and I want to pull at every instance and it's like yeah like that's what studying a lot of Talmud will do to you, like it will make you want to argue on irrelevant minutiae and go off on tangents and tell fantastical stories and come back to the thing and leave things half finished and unconcluded and um, maybe I don't fully embrace the impact that that sort of background has
Yes.
had.
And then there's two things in that, isn't there? That how others might perceive it and where it's come from, not just because of the Talmud, but um, having some similar traits and tendencies, so that with tenacity. If you imagine really that since the beginning of time, Jews have always been wandering, but then you construct a means of survival, which is informed by knowing and by being able to retreat and seemingly blend into the crowd or not. But the knowing part is crucial because you need to have your wits about you to survive. If survival isn't really much of a challenge, as it is for a lot of people on this planet, you don't have to actually think that much. You maybe need to know how to catch a fish or beg. And I make no judgment in that. I'm just saying our behaviors are informed by what our ancestors had to get through to get us here.
there's a thing a friend of mine shared a few years ago, which was uh, someone asking them, like, I don't know, why are Jews so neurotic, or why are they so like risk averse? And it's like it's because like we're the ones that like got out, like
Yeah.
we're the descendants of the people that said like I don't like the vibe around here, let's catch the next boat, and everyone
Right.
else died. So like this kind of it's funny and it's tragic and it's true and it's
And
there's
it's
something to that.
really an effective survival mechanism.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all here. All of us who are here because our ancestors, A, had a lot of sex and figured out how to keep going. Because clans and tribes die out all the time. No one really pays attention. Languages disappear, cultures, values, traditions, whatever, they disappear. And what we're constantly distilled down to is the qualities that survived or allow us to go on. I was having an interesting conversation a few weeks ago with the former wife of a rabbi. And I was like, but why does the law not allow people who've got like Jewish relatives, like quite close, to be included? And she explained the rules, and I was like, okay. And I was still sort of bothered, but I respect it. And then I thought to myself, what difference does it make? It's in the gene pool working its way through the system anyway. It doesn't matter what you name it, it matters that it's passed on. And, when I look at Barbadians and how smart they are, I'm like, East Africans and Jews and Amerindians, of course.
Of
But,
course.
these things are all there in their own poetic and beautiful ways.
Yeah. And it's also it's not it's a level deeper than asking your team like what are you good at, and they'll be like I write real good JavaScript, and you're like that's nice, and then you move on to the next person who says I write really good tests for Java, and and we go into sort of skills, um, but there's this level beyond it, which is or above it or below it, not quite sure, alongside it, which is who are you that you found yourself accumulating these skills, or what loyal what values, what, as you said, loyalties do you have that have meant that you've ended up in this team doing this work, caring about this thing, highly skilled at this kind of activity, and what does that tell us about you, and how does that explain what makes you wonderful, and also what like causes conflicts and what makes things difficult in the team. We tend to be more functional, rational. If only I had all the right skills in the right room at the right time, then like the work will get done. And that's not really how it works. There's a lot of stuff that sits beyond that as well.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, and thank you for sharing that, because that highlights something else that's rather important. Is quite often in our quite critical, judgmental world, we can throw the baby out with the bathwater. So people identify this is my skill, this is my strength, and they'll go on that track because they've got it. It's like, I'm going to stay in my lane. But meanwhile, the people on the other two lanes might be whizzing past you, and you're not even realizing or recognizing that they are harnessing a strength that you have but have interpreted as a weakness. And so you've thrown it out. When I work with individuals in coaching in that way, that's what I love about the systemic as perspective. Is it gives them, oh, and you, by the way, you have this. You left that when you were like, oh, my dad's awful, or my mother was too much of this, so I refuse to take any of that. And you throw out all of these skills and talents that when we dismiss our family members and they're surprised to discover that the thing they dismissed or had contempt for was the essential thing that they needed to go to the next step or phase in their job, or have the courage to start their own organization, or meet the right partner. Or actually, I come from people who do lead. Why did I think I wasn't a leader? Whatever it is, all of those things are quite handy to have. You don't have to use them all the time, but if you know you can draw on them, why wouldn't you?
Yeah, I'm thinking about myself. It's my podcast. If people don't like it, they can switch off. The I'm thinking about like where might be those exiled parts or whatever they are that I've gone, no, like those don't belong here. Those are no good. Those are things I've rejected. That actually, when I do embrace them, like lead to like the really good stuff. And there's maybe like an element. The example that I'm thinking of is um, maybe like with playfulness or with I don't know. It was always like the right thing to do is like focus down and stop the nonsense and stop the like I don't know the wordplay and the silliness and whatever, and study and learn stuff um, and there's something to that. But then also if then when I come to work and I think the play bits of it are not really allowed here or there, you're not really supposed to bring playfulness or silliness or transformative, like really meaningful, ritualistic experiences into the workplace. That's not professional. Well, then you end up being like a dry robot manager of a team. And whenever
Yeah.
I've been able, yeah, whenever I've been able to bring the right amount of, I don't know, ritualistic elements to my teamwork or playfulness or silliness, or we did something today called a future perspective, which is where um, you take a team and you say, we're about to embark on a piece of work. Let's imagine it's 1 year from now, like 1 year from now, and it's gone horribly wrong. What went wrong, and then what advice would you give ourselves? And I made them. This is something I did well today. Is I made them turn off their cameras. I said, when you turn your cameras back on, it will be 1 year from now. It will be 20th of February 2026, and we're gonna be like dissecting the car crash of a project that we've just engaged in. And I sort of insisted on using that language and things like that. Yeah,
That's
I'm going to
fantastic.
reflect on that.
Yeah. I think that's a really wonderful thing because the spontaneity of our creativity can sometimes, get lost. And it's so valuable, those little gems, um, uh, to bring those. I mean, what I loved about doing this kind of thing was the question was, where does our knowing come from? Where does our not knowing come from? But once you kind of get comfortable with, I have no idea where this idea just came from, but I'm going to try and experiment and bring it. And that will usually be the most valuable piece of kit. I bought the whole day with all those months of planning and figuring out minute by minute. The spontaneous knowing, which is a crystallized uh, distillation of all of our knowing, and it arrives in a moment like a spark of inspiration, but often it arrives so quietly that we don't trust it. It's not actually even an aha, it's just a, those are beautiful. Those are really, really beautiful. And if one has strength and trust in oneself, and brings those to one's work. We all watch these videos and TED Talks about these dynamic people who built big businesses and they have this little quirky thing that they do. And that's just the one they tell us about.
Mm.
But the other ones that they're drawing on, people say, oh, they're practicing witchcraft. Well, they're not really. I mean, it kind of is, but it's not. It's intuition and trusting the unknown and the unknowable. Yeah,
Also, what's
that's
wrong? What's wrong with witchcraft?
well, nothing's wrong with witchcraft. It's rather marvelous. I have to be careful because, in Africa it means something very different. But yeah, I think witchcraft or spell casting spells or conjuring are all within our capacity, and I think it's wonderful if we can do more of it and trust that process rather than regular formula of this person said this and this person said that. That has a place too, but doesn't really excite me.
It's the Enlightenment left us with lots of gifts and rationality and scientific modernity and all these different things are they're great, and we get plenty of that. And it's probably time to work out, like, why did we hang on to witchcraft for so long? Like, what is it about being connected to the ground and to stories and to like mystical, like not nonsense, but in like a good nonsense. Like, it's not sensical and it's still valuable and it's still useful. Like, these patterns have helped us over time, and they're not just like vestiges to get rid of. And like dry scientific rationalism doesn't make for a very rich life or much creativity or understanding the humans that you're trying to work with. You can't do it through numbers and logic, at least as easily. And how to bring that back in to a society that, like you say, is um, is not familiar with it anymore, or we go not like I'm talking about witchcraft here. It's like, well,
No,
maybe I'm talking about
no,
witchcraft here. I don't know.
we are talking about a kind of witchcraft. And it's interesting because you're tapping into something that's been kind of circling my whatever for quite some time, which is some of the stories we have and we're throwing out with the bathwater. I don't think we've really looked at them clearly enough. Um, and, this, if we were to go all the way back to, well, Eve, whether it's Eve from the Bible or Eve, mitochondrial Eve, the mother of humans and so on and so forth, is that story of Eve is loaded with the shame and the punishment of being booted out of Eden, right? So we come out into this world, out of the Garden of Eden, we come out into the wider world, and there's all this abundance because the garden's quite small and it's contained and it's got, I think, no, it doesn't get to two of everything until it gets to Noah. But there's so much life. And because of the shame and the punishment that we're still holding about ourselves and not being quite enough, or I must behave like this, or I must confine myself to fit in this box so that people will still love me and keep me safe, means we can't agree to literally the abundance of life. And that's problematic for everyone because it's in the abundance that everything we need to support our survival resides. But if we don't think we're worthy of having that abundance, how can we move towards it? And life then becomes burdened by the abundance. It's like, come on, come and take it. We're like, no, I'm not worth it. Let me hide here and play small. So I think we need to adjust some of our myths, and that because when I go home to Africa, what I'm amazed by is they live with all of this abundance, and as a result, they live simply because they're not trying to buy up stuff to hide the feeling that they're not unworthy by showing, oh, I have this much stuff. I mean, they do that a little bit with, their villages. Oh, my mud hut's bigger than yours, or what? Well, my spear is definitely, or definitely how many cows, you have. But there's something in that, and I'm trying to figure out how do we start to reframe those stories. Because we do a lot of shaming people who can agree to the abundance of life rather than asking ourselves, why is it we're willing to agree to so little? These oceans are vast. Everything is vast. I stand on the edge of, the beachfront in France, and I go back and I look at the photograph. I'm like, wow, the humans look like ants, and that's just one beach. I think you get what I mean a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking it's easier to say those people are mad and silly, and um, uh, there's something wrong with them, or they've lost the plot, or they're not serious, or something, rather than realize that like the joy that people who identify with witchcraft, or people who I don't know, people who really take joy in things, people who really embrace their passions and their spontaneity, and uh, admitting that's available to you might be hard, because then you've got to ask yourself, like, why didn't I take that? It's much easier to go, those are woo people over there, they with
Yeah.
their silliness.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, that comes back to belonging. I do understand why they do it because they belong to groups of people who said no, 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 no. An imbalance without what happens when there isn't yes. Yeah, it's another day. Woo, we're still here. By the time they realize it, there isn't much life left.
Yeah. And I think about like the organizations that I've worked with where a lot of the solutions to the problems are available. Like they are. There's it, the abundance that we're talking about here with the abundance of opportunity, of life, or of joy. Um, Maybe then if we sort of constrict the scope down to in my company and the thing that I'm trying to do with my team in the way that I'm trying to make a difference out there in the world, even if it's sell shit, I don't know, whatever. That there's infinite paths through to any solution. Some of them are harder and some of them cost a lot of energy. Um, and that's where this way of thinking about the world is, it has utility, or it's valuable, or it's above and beyond the human joy that it creates. Yeah, we can put that to the side for now. It's more I don't know. It's effective. It's an effective way of being in the world. It opens up more solutions to you. It allows
Yeah,
you to flourish in the ways that you want to more readily.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, those are beautiful images to hold of possibility and potential.
That feels like a good place to start to on the cusp of unlimited potential and possibility and abundance. Zita, if my audience wants to find you, where can they find you?
Ah, okay. I think I'm moving home currently. So I'm going to be spending a lot more time on Substack. So that's Life Therapy with Zita dot Substack. Yeah. I'm so new, I haven't even figured out my handle. But since I went there, I'm like, oh my God, I can't, I've got to stop writing because it's just like, so I'm still figuring out. But there is a really good place to find me. And all the other places you might find me, I will be telling you to come and find me on Substack. But I do have a
Right.
website, which is lifetherapywithzita.com, which is a place that will direct you to my Substack.
All right.
But if you're looking for me, it's Life Therapy with Zita Instagram, Life Therapy with Zita Twitter, Life Therapy with Zita, or Zita Tulyahikayo on LinkedIn, um, or see me on Substack. And there are some videos now, I think, somewhere on YouTube, which is Life Therapy with Zita. Or just drop me a mail.
I'll link to all those things. All roads lead back to Substack, it would appear.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Zita, thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me.
Oh, and thank you so much for having me. It's been really lovely to be here and to talk to a great listener and also hear your reflections back. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you for listening to the Intelligent Teams podcast. I've been your host, Daniel Susser. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a good chance you'll enjoy being a subscriber to the Intelligent Teams Substack. It's intelligentteams.substack.com. You'll receive a free weekly newsletter featuring either an episode of this podcast or writings about cognitive science and building intelligent teams. See you next time.